Welcome, everybody, to Philosophy Friday. And today we have a very interesting discussion about how to have a discussion. And more specifically, how do you have a discussion in a constructive way rather than in a argumentative and sometimes in a way in which there are hurt feelings and things of that nature. And so as an overview, we're going to discuss one, the problem at many companies focused on winning versus discussion and seeking truth. Second, the potential impact of company culture and how that can potentially impact how people discuss things. Third, specific techniques to facilitate more constructive discussions. And four, if we have any wrap up, any ideas or ways in which, Drew, from your experience, maybe things we can recommend to help improve the situation. And with us today, we do have Drew Levin. Welcome, Drew. And for folks in the audience, I was wondering if you could give a brief, kind of history about your background. And in particular, I think you are specifically well suited for this discussion based upon two companies, Zynga and Riot, where, you kind of worked and are working now, which in my opinion, we'll get into it, but I think have particularly interesting kind of philosophies or kind of approaches when it comes to this kind of thing.
Really, really great to be here. Excited to have this conversation with you. So, like you said, I work at Riot Games. I'm head of product on one of the R&D games that we've got going on here. Before Riot, I worked at Zynga for a little over 3 years in a variety of product roles there. Before Zynga, I worked at Congregate and a different mobile games studio. So I've been in games for like 7 years now. Before that, I worked in politics for 5 years. So I've certainly got a diverse set of experiences when it comes
Right.
to working with people in different environments, differently ideologically based workplaces, shall we say.
Right. So you're even more better suited for this discussion than I originally thought. But all right, yeah, maybe we could just get the conversation kicked off first just by talking about the potential importance of being able to argue at a company in a healthy way. And I kind of shared with you, Drew, this 2019 Harvard Business Review article titled, How to Debate Ideas Productively at Work. And in that article, the research there shows that cognitive diversity makes groups smarter. And secondly, that studies show that, quote, most mergers and acquisitions don't fail because of conflict. They fail from organizational silence that stems from fear of conflict. And so, given that context, I thought we could talk about, at least in my experience, an often very typical situation at a lot of companies. And so, let's say you're in a meeting. Two people have conflicting opinions on an issue. They engage in a debate, but at times, very much like a political or religious debate, oftentimes these arguments shift to become kind of personal. And the objective then, in many cases, becomes it's no longer about, hey, let's have this very constructive discussion, but more about to seek truth and to get to a conclusion, but it becomes a war to win that debate. And so I wanted to kind of get your thoughts. I've seen it a lot, and unfortunately, there have been environments where I've seen more of the bad than the good. But I also wanted to get your thoughts in terms of your experience. Have you seen that kind of a situation? And when you see that kind of situation, what's your thought process or your approach?
So I think there's a bunch of ways to have a bad argument and very few ways to have a good one, right? It's the old Anna Karenina quote, right? Like every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. So like one of them, which you pointed out, is just like arguments can turn sort of bitter and personal, where I find that often stems from a lack of trust, right? Where people don't believe that the other person is engaging in good faith, and so they seek to win an argument by characterizing someone who would dare to disagree with them in negative personal terms, because it's no longer about the discussion. The discussion becomes sort of a stand-in for whether or not you're on the same team. And if it's established that you're not on the same team, then the discussion's not actually about whatever you're talking about. It's about, like tribal alignment and whether or not you can identify yourself as like good or bad, on the right side or the wrong side. And that is a lot of what you see in sort of like nationally televised American political debates, is like people not actually talking about the issue. It's like me good, you bad. Like how do I like characterize this in very stark terms? And so winning becomes projecting that image to an interested audience, and like being the good side of the good bad divide. That I have not seen as much in corporate environments, but it comes up in other places where people discuss hot button issues, and I'm sure we'll touch on that later. One thing that I have seen in corporate environments is people who will use sort of bad faith argumentation to win arguments, even though it's not necessarily the best characterization of their own point or their I don't want to say opponent's point, but the point of the person who disagrees with them, right? So um, if you're having an argument and you resort to some sort of logical fallacy and or some rhetorical trick that uh, your your counterpart can't address satisfactorily, you might win the argument, right? You might like stun them into silence or get them to stop arguing with you about whether or not your point is valid. But the damage that you've done to your workplace is actually like much more important than the fleeting moment of pride that you get from like winning that engagement, because again, you're supposed to be on the same team, and yet you've managed to like bamboozle someone into silence by uh you know tricking them or misleading them or misdirecting their attention.
Right. And maybe like one thing that has not been said, but seems like it's tied to this, might actually be the way in which some companies make decisions. And maybe this kind of
Mhm.
ties into, we can talk about company culture next, but like,
Sure.
and so like, how much do you think, and so certainly you could have debates about, hot topic items, but I would say like if just kind of thinking back in terms of some of the bigger arguments that I've seen on teams, it generally maybe at least in my experience, it's been because people were trying to drive a decision in one way or another, right? And so
Yep.
um, I, I don't know. Do you think like how tied do you think the decision making structure might be tied to like the potential bitterness or the way in which people are arguing?
Oh, I think that it's very often tied, right? So if you have people who have like more or less proximity to structural power,
Yeah.
that's going to affect the way that they argue, right? If so, I'll give you an example. Uh, Zynga is sort of a very PM dominated culture, for better
Right.
and for worse.
Hmm.
And I think that there are like very strongly expressed good and bad things that come out of that.
Right.
Um, One of the things that comes out of that is the sort of baseline expectation among PMs on game teams that they're going to be able to make calls. And so when someone asks a PM to justify their decision, um, the very good PMs will bring data and sort of express an axiom that I think we're probably going to talk about later, right? Strong opinions loosely held. Uh, there are others that, when challenged, react defensively and reflexively, as though it's sort of offensive to them that someone would question whether or not they get to make this decision, and they resort to sort of dishonest ways of engaging with the topic because that is more comfortable for them than um, you know yielding ground or saying like, yeah, you're right, we should do it your way, or we should go with your idea, or your idea is better, or whatever it is, because there is also sort of a status orientation at play, right? There is um, I exist in this sort of like organizational structural hierarchy, and I don't want to give up the status and the comfort that goes with that, even for a moment, to someone who who might get used to challenging me and saying like, oh, um, that they're not actually right all the time, or maybe even all that often. And so, what does that do to someone's self perception if they start to let that happen?
Yeah, I do think, and we can talk about company culture next, or maybe even now, but it seems to me like if the decision making process or person, like the owner of the call, is clear, it feels like the situations where arguments get much more heated in a, more of the company context, not like the political types of topics that could be more emotional, but
Yeah.
it does seem like, just kind of thinking back, that if you have a clear decision making structure and an owner, and it's clear, well, Bill's going to
Mhm.
make the call, so let's argue it out, then maybe a
Yep.
lot of those arguments will not be as tense. So maybe I can ask you about that in terms of like company
Sure.
culture, and you've been part of a
Mhm.
number of companies: Congregate, Zynga, Riot, all companies that have demonstrated success in the past. But when you think about those kind of cultures that you've been in, or if you were to uh, talk about how the cultural context may impact how people argue at work, maybe I can get your thoughts on that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So I think that even just like drawing contrasts between Zynga and Riot, there's a few things that come to mind. So one is, like I said, Zynga is sort of a PM dominated culture. And so you go into a lot of discussions on game teams knowing what person or what type of person or what role in a room is going to make a final call.
Yeah,
And so that does a few things. One, it's tremendously clarifying, right? Because at the end of the day, someone's going to make this call. Someone is very often structurally empowered to do so, and so the argument becomes about how do you persuade this person um, who's structurally empowered to just make a call and move on, and can do so sort of whenever, um, to adopt your perspective or to consider your point of view, and that is a super high leverage role on most game teams. And Zynga hires sort of a pretty, um, I suppose, diversely backgrounded set of people for those types of roles, and looks for people who are really smart and can express ideas in creative and varied ways. And the people who tend to succeed in those roles and get elevated tend to be people who are, at minimum, good at talking about ideas and good at coming across as very persuasive, articulate, all of that. And at best, are good at drawing out those the value from the people around them. Right. A thing that is really great about being the decision maker is it's actually way less threatening.
yeah,
People play it the other way, I think, because they feel insecure about like how much responsibility it carries. But it is actually a tremendously comfortable position from which to solicit feedback and ideas and let other people do most of the talking. Because at the end of the day, if you're the one making the call anyway, what does it matter like whose idea wins or like what the argument was? You will ultimately have to figure out like what the right thing is. So like get other people to explore the best possible form of the argument, get them to share their perspective, because the at the end of the day, like if you don't want it, you don't have to go ahead with it. And so that is tremendously empowering from a decision making perspective. um, I think that there's a pretty wide range of how people interact with that responsibility, like I said. But one thing that it leads to, because there is so much power vested in that role, is it leads to sort of idiosyncratic decision making structures where you might encounter a decision getting made one way or getting considered one way on one team that gets made very differently on a different team. And it's not that one is necessarily always better than the other. It's that these are two very different people who solve problems in different ways. And so they're going to come at it with different perspectives and may arrive at different conclusions. And that is organizationally a strength of Zynga's, actually. Diversity of thought and the ability to um, approach things from different perspectives, arrive at different conclusions, um, experiment with different approaches, and share out learnings from all of those approaches. And it's something that is woven pretty tightly into Zynga's DNA. And it fosters a lot of learning across teams. Um, I think by contrast, Riot is an incredibly values oriented company. And, before the show, we were talking about, I suppose, a public perception of Riot, which if you want, you can sort of lay out.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. So like, I think, we were talking earlier where the public perception, or at least what I've heard from folks who used to work there or currently work there, is that, Riot interviews very, very carefully, and they really test for cultural fit, and especially like trying to eliminate assholes. And so like really trying to check to make sure the people that come into Riot are people who can get along with one another. So like the view is, and I'm not sure, like you tell me, that the people at Riot are the type of people who get along well, or who you wouldn't expect anyone at Riot to be calling anyone out for specific mistakes or problems or things like that. Whereas Zynga, on the other hand, has this reputation of more of a confrontational culture in which, maybe even part of the way you're evaluated is how well you perform in arguments and things of that nature. But the other thing too is like you're supposed to argue and have conflict. So like the contrast between the two would be argument and conflict is kind of encouraged at Zynga with the underlying notion that whatever you do, make sure you back it up with data, or basically, shut the fuck up, basically. Whereas Riot is at least viewed as more of a collaborative type of organization. You don't, say mean things about someone else there, that kind of thing. So, I mean, maybe you can tell me whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, right? Because I think that if you go and like talk to a lot of people that I worked with at Zynga, they would describe me as like a great cultural fit at Zynga, and somehow I'm also a great cultural fit at Riot. So like, you tell me how that one works, but I think that there's kernels of truth in both, and I think that there's sort of uh, some glossed over points that I want to harden a little bit. So it is true that at Zynga, it is a valuable skill, both personally and organizationally, to be able to argue well. I think that Zynga tends to attract and be more willing to hire people who are good at what I would characterize as like debate club argumentation, where you are more willing to and more interested in like winning arguments versus like reaching the truth. I think that the very best folks at Zynga pretty uniformly are truth seeking rather than argument winning. I think that like the good but like not great people at Zynga tend to be like more mixed in their orientation. And so when I say like truth seeking versus argument winning, it goes back to stuff like, okay, um, you know, you and I disagree. How much do I try to understand your perspective? How much do I try and bring out the very best in your point? How much do I try and like, you know, put my point down, walk around to the other side of the table, sit next to you, work with you on developing your point, figure out what the very best form of that argument is, right? Like, I'm not strawmanning you. I'm not bulldozing your point. I'm not trying to talk over you. I'm not trying to like make you look stupid with whatever rhetorical flourishes like I may have learned in debate club. Like, I'm actually like trying to inhabit your perspective, bring it to life, and like make it the very best it can be. And then walk back around to my side of the table and be like, is that a better argument than everything that I've been like arguing for? Because a lot of people are just like, oh, like I saw this data, like I have this perspective, I like use this pattern matching technique, I use this framework, and it just tells me that the right answer is X. And so like everything that like pulls away from X in this conversation is something that must be like beaten down and defeated. And so like you can use a bunch of like data driven arguments and like all of these techniques that you could characterize as positive to push your point forward, but do it in a way that's like really just like interpersonally bad and fundamentally dishonest. I
Right.
don't think that that's like tremendously common, but I think that that is something that in a culture that encourages conflict, you will also bring people in that are practitioners of those sorts of dark arts. And to your point, they're sort of net negative. So I think that's sort of the good and the bad of Zynga encouraging conflict. I think Riot, and I'm glad that you used words like culture fit, because I have sort of like a longer bit that I'm happy to do here some other time on culture fit. I
Sure.
think that a lot of people, when they talk about like, oh, culture fit interviews, if a company doesn't have a really strongly expressed set of values, culture fit interviews become basically vibe checks from hiring managers. And this is something that like basically every hiring round will have like a culture fit interview. And in the absence of really strongly articulated values, it's whatever questions the hiring manager wants to ask the applicant, and good is whatever, you know, answers make them feel like, oh yeah, like I want to work with this person. And so it's incredibly subjective. One of the things that I really found impressive about Riot when I was interviewing with them is their commitment to what's called a structured interview, which is also something that Harvard Business Review has written at length about. Uh, One of the things that I sort of pushed at Zynga in my time as a hiring manager was moving away from sort of more on the fly. Each interviewer brings their own set of questions. Um, you pick panelists and they ask good questions and they give good feedback, and that's sort of how you hire good people. And towards everyone asks the same set of questions. You have a scorecard. You have right and wrong, like better and worse ways of answering these questions. Um, what it has been shown to do is reduce bias in interviewing processes, right? Because if you ask everyone the same questions, you're going to get a range of answers. Some of them are very good, some of them are very bad. And if you believe that your questions are really high signal about whether or not you ought to hire someone, then one, you should ask those questions all the time. And two, you should know what the right answers to those questions are. And three, the people who give you the most right, the most best versions of those uh, answers should be the people that you seek to hire. And so the fact that Riot does that, and does that across craft interviews, across values interviews, is really, really impressive to me, and showcases a commitment to um, sort of hiring objectivity that I have not seen so far at other places. So that's one. Two, they have, multiple modules of what we call values interviews. And so this is basically a set of questions designed to understand whether someone is going to be a culture fit in a very specific sense of the word. Riot has 5 values that it holds up, um, both sort of externally and internally. I mean, they're not secrets, right? You can like go to the Riot website and like look at the values page, and these things get invoked in like all sorts of internal processes, conversations, and they drive a tremendous amount of sort of first principles alignment, right? It isn't a question of like, what are we optimizing on here, right? One of the things that is really prominent at Zynga is the question of like, does this technique or does this feature or does this approach work? And does it work is characterized very, very often in business terms, right? Did we drive a revenue lift? Did we drive a retention lift? Did we drive an engagement lift? And you measure that, you experiment on it, you do a readout on it, you share that out with people, and people say, oh, like this team observed like this uplift from approaching things this way. We are going to start by assuming that that is valid data that we can apply in some way to our context, and that becomes evidence in favor of doing this thing. And so Zynga learns very aggressively, shares info very aggressively, and um, tries to optimize both like within a game and across its portfolio very well. And again, finds people who respect that as a valid source of wisdom and encourages them to propagate it as often as possible. Riot is easily the place where I've seen the most first principles alignment about what it is to have an idea be valid or successful because of how tightly aligned people are on first principles things, right? There isn't a question of like, what are we trying to optimize here? It's, we have these values, everyone knows them. You have to have an orientation towards them pretty strongly in order to get through our interview process. Um, and so when you get into disagreements, the disagreement space is actually like more constrained because it isn't like what are we trying to get as our North Star outcome here. The North Star is always known, right? It's the stuff on the website. You can go read it again. It's what is the best way to create outcomes aligned with these values. And so you're not having all of these like hidden arguments about like, if you think of like, should we have a loot table that like has value X or 2X, right? Like just like very, very common tuning economy discussion in games. You can have like a multifaceted, multi-layered disagreement about that. And so like, should we be generous in our loot tables is like one aspect of it. What are we trying to do by like creating this loot table and implementing it in the game is like another aspect. A lot of those sort of like sub-level disagreements are more explicitly defined and called out at Riot so that they're just like, it isn't that there is no room to disagree with them, it's that that doesn't come up in a lot of discussions. You start by having aligned on that stuff because
Right.
people think about it really, really deeply. And so what you disagree with is like a much narrower, more constrained space. And so it isn't that like Riot hires a bunch of people who are like, kumbaya, hold hands and sing. It's that it works really hard to say, here's what we're about, here's what we're trying to accomplish, here's what the realm of successful outcomes looks like.
Yeah.
And you can get on board with that. And we have a really strong perspective about how to make games as a result. Or you can explore like what it means to not be, like player experience first oriented at like plenty of other companies. And that's fine with us too. But what we're not going to do is disagree over whether or not like the work that we do on this loot table is going to put player experience first, because it is. It's just like not up for debate.
Yeah, and so it kind of sounds like in a bit of a summary for our audience that, I mean, you had talked about at Zynga, you've got some people who are kind of trying to win arguments, and more who are more open and seek to really try to understand the other person. And it sounds like, so there's things that can be done at the personal level, and I think at Zynga it's a little bit more dependent on the person, but
Yeah,
from a Riot perspective, it seems like there are things that the company does, whether it's through the recruitment process, whether it's through grounding a lot of discussion through first principle thinkings coming from the values and things. So you've got systems in place that help orient the thinking so that some things
yep,
where there might have been discussion or debate at Zynga is a little bit, there's more of a basis or kind of like a framework underpinning Riot where some of those discussions may not take place.
yeah. We have really sharp razors to help us make those
Right,
decisions.
right, right. And so just kind of like coming back to like to the company culture, or maybe the things that can happen at the company level to create an environment in which you don't have the divisiveness and you don't have people really trying to like really attack one another. It does sound like, one, we kind of touched upon like this notion of having a clear structure in terms of the decision making process, because ultimately these arguments are trying to drive towards a decision of some kind, right? And so
Yep.
if you have AORs or if you have a clear decision making process, seems like that would help. To
Yes.
your point, having some kind of system, framework, values, first principle thinking to help really align people in a way in which a lot of arguments, not maybe not every argument, but a lot of arguments kind of go away. Maybe the third thing would just be, I do think that at some companies there's like this macho culture, or even where some people are evaluated based upon how well they can argue and how just just how charismatic or just how well they can win arguments, right? And so maybe
Yep.
the way in which people are evaluated, and whether like are these things being done in a big room in front of people and it's like the performance, Bill versus Fred, or
Yeah.
and then like the way that even the setup that happens could then lead to more divisiveness, and then again just like I want to win versus I want to get to the truth. Maybe the next thing is just also like safety, right? Like at some companies,
Yeah.
If the culture is you make a mistake and you're hosed or you're not safe, then in that case, I think people are just going to try to win arguments just to show that they haven't made a mistake.
Yeah.
Or you get a negative performance review, you lose comp or you lose your job or things like that. And so maybe those are like, I don't know if you can think of other things, but I do think maybe myself as a founder of a startup, these are like some of the things that I try to think about, like how can we
Yeah.
not only at the personal level, because there's things we can do there, but also at the company level, what can we do to create an environment in which people aren't going to be at each other's throats. And maybe the last thing I would say is one thing we also try to do is just try to make it clear that arguments are okay. And so there's like this
Yeah.
there's like this graph I like to show. It's like this dialectical synthesis, but there's this professor in Japan named
Hmm.
Ichijiro Nonaka, where there's like this cone, and it shows that like it's only through opposing perspective and arguments that you reach like new knowledge, or you find the truth. And so at least what I try to do at our company is to really reinforce that notion of, guys, let's have the debates with respect, and
Yeah.
and try to get to truth. But I don't know. Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you touched on some really good points where it goes to sort of what behavior is sort of normatively rewarded, right? You can have company cultures that reward or punish changing your mind. You can have company cultures that reward or punish like getting it right the first time versus arriving at the best outcome. And depending on how people experience and even perceive your culture rewarding certain types of behavior, they'll change their behavior very often because that's what social norms
Yeah,
are, right?
yeah.
It's people sensing like what the power structure wants you to do and changing their behavior to appease the power
Right.
structure. So if the power structure says uh, you only get one chance to stake your claim, and then if you move, then you're weak and wrong and stupid and
Yeah,
like untrustworthy, then fuck, like once you pick your side, that's it. Like it's live or die on that
yeah,
hill. But if you see leaders set an example by being willing to listen and hear people out and change their mind, then the whole room can change, because now it's not, you know, can I win this argument? It's, oh, like every every like really senior person cares most about like getting the right answer. And so the right answer is like whatever the very best argument we can collectively bring to bear on this is. And if we somehow collectively can't come up with the best answer, then we as a team are going to lose the trust of
right,
leadership that we can produce good work. And so we need to work really hard together and explore every possible sort of option and argument. And it's really important to listen to each other. It's really important to have a team that can come up with different kinds of arguments from different perspectives, from different backgrounds, because what leadership cares about is whether or not we've thought of
right,
everything. And so that balance of incentives, right? Even just those two really stark examples can create very different interpersonal dynamics because people are ultimately optimizing their behavior to whatever the social norms are in their company.
right. It reminds me of the famous Charlie Munger quote: "Show me the incentive, and I'll show you the outcome." But
Exactly.
certainly I do think like I feel like this is an area where companies should, and leaders at companies should spend more time thinking about, are we setting our company up for having these kinds of arguments in a healthy and constructive way? And certainly there's responsibility at the personal level, but I do think that at the
Yeah,
company level there's a lot of stuff that you can do to create a better environment for it.
absolutely.
So maybe now shifting to the personal level and specific
Sure.
techniques to facilitate constructive discussions. And, I know that there was some discussion in our Slack group about the Steelman technique. It was something, I was not aware of besides, when I listened to Lex Friedman podcast. I think he's mentioned it at times. But so talking about specific techniques. So you are in an argument with somebody, like what I wanted to walk through a number of these techniques, but starting with Steelman,
Sure.
maybe you can explain what that is and how it can be applied in an argument.
Sure. Yep. So I learned this because I read a bunch of blog posts. Several of them are from people who would identify themselves as sort of in the rationalist community, not sort of like worth going too deep into like what the rationalist community is, but it's a group of people that like think very hard about how to talk about stuff and like ask good questions and arrive at right answers. I think that's like the kindest and most succinct way of characterizing sort of what they're about. And so I encountered this as sort of an inversion of the common logical fallacy straw man. A straw man argument is one where you intentionally or otherwise mischaracterize someone's actual argument as sort of the worst version of their point, right? So if you say, "Hey, I think um, that we should go to McDonald's for lunch today," then because I really like their burgers, then I might say, "Oh, like so what? You just like love garbage food? Like you just love food that's bad for you? You just want to eat unhealthily, right?" And so I've already like mischaracterized and reframed your argument in ways that are far less charitable, um, and in doing so have uh, sort of reframed what you're saying in a light that is far less likely to be something that other people want to adopt. And that's very intentional, right? And you can see this constantly if you go like turn on a TV in US election season, right? People are just strawmanning the absolute hell out of each other's arguments because they're not actually trying to find common ground, they're trying to win. And strawmanning someone's argument is what you do if you want to win an argument, not if you want to like persuade them or sort of get to the truth underlying whatever it is that they're saying. Steelmanning is the exact opposite. You might say, "Hey, I want to go to McDonald's because I really like McDonald's," and it's like, okay, like what are you trying to get out of the experience? And so now I'm trying to help you figure out the best version of whatever it is that you're trying to say. You say, "Oh, like I really want comfort food," and it's like, "Oh, like what makes you comfortable?" And it's like, well, I have like really positive associations with McDonald's because like that was my where my parents took me when I was having a bad day, and so like I've actually been having a bad day, and like this is going to be like the very best thing for my mood. It's just like great, like that is a much deeper understanding of why you want to go to McDonald's. You can apply this to like why do you want to tune the loot table this way, and it's like, okay, well, I think it's the best. Well, why is it the best? You can strawman it and say, well, I think that you don't even know what the best is, and now I'm going to like try and make you look stupid, or I'm going to try and mischaracterize your argument. Or you can say, okay, what are you relying on to like help you form an understanding of what the best is, and what are your goals? Let's like try and build the very best case for
Right.
this. And so, what it does on sort of a fundamental level is it orients you and the person you're having this conversation with on the same side. You put down any no buts and you focus on yes and for a while. You say, okay, you think this. Help me understand this. What does this imply? What information are you drawing on? Really, like, let's paint the picture together. And you work with them until it's just like, yep, I feel like I've been heard. I feel like you understand my perspective. I have nothing else to add. Here's all the information I'm drawing on. Here it is. Here's the argument. And you step back and you're like, okay, this is the best version of your argument. We've explored everything, and here is your point and why you believe it and the evidence that you're drawing on. Great. Um, that is already a rarity in how people engage in discussions in corporate
Right.
environments, right? A lot of people feel like they don't have time for it or don't have the patience or just are fundamentally incurious, or are just like waiting for their turn to talk in a bunch of meetings. And so they don't get as much from their very smart coworkers who deserve to be there just as much as they do, because they don't ask, they don't listen, they're not interested in the way that they ought to be. And so stalemating is a great way of getting the most out of the people
Got it.
around you.
So do you go to McDonald's or do you not go to McDonald's? I'm just kidding.
Depends on my
All
mood.
right. Um,
I went to McDonald's last
all
night.
right. Awesome.
It has a job to do, and it does it well.
Okay. And I think to some degree, after you've explained it, it sounds a little bit, well, not the same, but similar in some degree to this blog post that Adam Grant wrote, and he explains this concept called complexification. And so I don't know if you had a chance to go through that post, but he wrote a post called "How to Argue About Abortion." And for our audience, I thought I'd read like the very beginning of that post, and it begins like
Yeah.
this. Many people are understandably outraged about the Supreme Court's ruling to overturn Roe v. Wade, but they're expressing their fury in a way that closes others' minds and missing an opportunity to open them. If you want people to reconsider their deeply held beliefs, you need to help them recognize the nuances in their own views. Strong convictions trap us in what psychologists call binary bias. Reduce a complex spectrum into two oversimplified categories. People are good or evil. Beliefs are either right or wrong. And in addition, I thought I'd also just call out the subtitle to the post, which states, the goal isn't to convince others that you're right, it's to help them realize that they might be wrong. So I don't know, in terms of your experience with arguments and debates, have you had experience in terms of trying this kind of approach when you're at a crossroads on a decision, or you're arguing one way or the other? I mean, there's certainly the Stillman technique, but what is your understanding of this notion about complexification?
So a lot of what I try and do when I encounter sort of like really deeply rooted moral
Mm-hmm.
arguments, right? You're talking about like arguing about abortion, that some people would characterize it as the right to choose, the right to life. Already you get sort of the spread of how people uh, see it as a first principle disagreement. And so I think there it's really valuable to get at like, what are the things that you value? What are the first principles that you think are at play here? And what I found from talking about abortion actually quite a bit, having worked in politics and having been the sort in sort of my younger years to get into, 68 comment threads on Facebook about large moral issues that I had very little structural power to impact one way or the other, is that um, people are actually willing to talk about this stuff, but also that most people in those arguments are very interested in self-identification and sort of drawing lines between themselves, and are not actually interested in persuasion or even understanding. Um, I think that like I hold a very strong perspective in this, but I'm going to try and like keep it fairly circumspect and talk about like how to talk about it rather than
Okay.
what my perspective is. Um, so when you get down to sort of the base layer of like someone who believes that abortion should not exist in a legal form in America, or the world, what you find is that they feel very strongly about a concept of life and sort of the importance of it, people's right to it, the primacy of that right over other rights. And so they'll say things like, okay, um, there is nothing that you could tell me that is going to change my mind about whether or not killing someone is okay. Um, and so you have to sort of get at like, okay, well, help me understand someone, right? Because part of the abortion debate is, well,
Right.
when does life begin? And then you come over to the other side and it's like, okay, well, you know, where
Right.
does life begin, but also where do rights attach, right? Because one side is very interested in framing it about sort of the life and the ending of that life, wherever it may begin. um, the other side is saying, well, what about the rights to physical and personal autonomy and to medical privacy of the mother, of the pregnant person? And so you get sort of what are we actually talking about questions that I think may still end up in sort of these morally intractable places, but at least now you understand. Oh, you think that this is about life. I think that this is about bodily autonomy. You think that there's a world in which it's okay to prioritize life over physical autonomy, and I think that physical autonomy is more important than someone else's life. And so that is sort of where we might have to call it as an argument.
Right.
We understand that we disagree over the relative values of those as sort of like first principles.
Yeah, I think Adam Grant in that post references this research paper called The Effects of Complexity on Conversations Over Potentially Intractable Moral Conflict. So long, long title. But one of the interesting things there was that in that study, they found people who were on different ends of the abortion debate, and
Yep.
by introducing this concept of complexification, which I think has to do with some of the points that you're making, they were able to get these people on different sides of the debate to sign a joint statement from 46% in the case where they didn't have like the this kind of opening statement to help them understand kind of the nuances of abortion, to 100%. And I believe it's what you were saying, which is like, is the abortion debate just about life versus death, or would you agree that maybe at 9 months, maybe 9 months pregnant, that maybe you shouldn't have abortion would be wrong, maybe like pro-choice folks would agree that maybe 9 months would be too late, and then where in the spectrum is a good number. So there's a little bit more nuance rather than just bad, good, and then maybe like some pro-life people may agree, if you go into the complexity of it, that there may be situations like in the case where a mother giving birth to a child would die, or both would die, that maybe abortion would be okay, and things like that.
Yeah. And so I think that that's a great example, because even those are often peddled in extremely bad faith, right? Where one side is very interested in pretending that um, no abortion at 32 weeks or whatever is justifiable, when basically all of the abortions that happen there are like desired pregnancies that it turns out are just like fundamentally terminal and are going to cause like some combination of grave suffering, like incredible danger to the pregnant person's life, all of this stuff. And so like abortion is, one, a mercy, two, like net good in terms of like medical outcomes and safety for like whoever's pregnant and probably like their family, because like
Right.
going through with this is bad for whatever reason, like it's an ectopic pregnancy, whatever. And then on the other side, um I think there's sort of like the tendency to characterize anyone who would disagree about like the primacy of choice as like, oh, like very interested in like basically recreating Margaret Atwood's the Handmaid's Tale. It's just like, no, probably like not everyone who thinks that like you know abortion shouldn't happen at 8 months is like a religious theocrat. Like maybe they don't have like particularly nuanced view. Maybe they're a religious theocrat. Maybe they are like being lied to by religious theocrats. Maybe they just like have thought about this really hard and like disagree with you about like the fundamental values of like which moral good is like more important than the other.
Right. And I don't know if this is a perfectly good example, but just like a real life example of an argument over a decision. For example, we've been trying to decide on a
Yeah.
backend platform. Do we try and use like Heroic Labs Nakama versus Axelbyte versus Beamable versus whatever, right? And then there might be strong
Yeah.
opinions in terms of, well, I like this solution, I like that solution, but like I believe like the notion of complexification can also be applied if you were to use that to also define a framework. And so it's like, well, okay, what's
Yeah.
important to us? These categories of things. Okay, these categories of things. Well, now let's agree upon not the decision, but upon what the factors are that would impact the decision. And then once we understand the
Yeah.
factors that impact the decision, then let's try to understand, like, let's say, I will come up with the weighting, and then the people in the
Yeah.
company who can best characterize which is best amongst the different solutions could put a score on each of those factors or something like that. But
Yeah.
maybe that is a way of also kind of depersonalizing and trying to systematize,
Right.
an argument into something that's a little bit more tractable. um,
Yeah.
uh,
You try and take all of the specifics out of it, because it's very easy to get overly attached to the specifics, and you say, okay, what is like the generalizable true set of statements that I'm willing to back
right,
up about this situation and others, but it has to be extensible, right? I have to say, okay, for our backend solution, it has to be true that it's performant, that it, allows for this range
yeah,
of
cost,
devices, that it, like, yeah, it's not too costly, it's not too risky, like whatever it is. And so you say, this is the most important thing. I would trade off like this many units of utility here to get like this many units of utility here. And like, here's roughly how I would define units of utility. And so, like, you sort of go through that framework process. And then ideally, what you find is that your answer falls at the bottom of that sort of meta exercise, rather than trying to solve every single problem as though it's this like deeply bespoke thing.
right. And the third kind of concept that I wanted to discuss was a concept described by Ray Dalio, or a set of principles by Ray Dalio in terms of arguments. And
Mhm.
he has 4 points. And the first is, he states, don't be open minded with everyone. Spend your time exploring ideas with the most believable people you have access to. And so I guess the point there would be, maybe you should just not have an argument, or you should have an argument with the people who are who have the most credibility to have that argument with. um,
Well, and the people who are going to approach it with the same good faith that you are, right? Like, I've I've spent a lot of time in like fruitless discussions trying to get down to first principles with people who are just like not interested in going there with me, right? They are more interested in posturing and like identity group signaling, right? Like, whatever their objectives are, they're not aligned with mine. And so like the time that I would spend in conversation with them was fundamentally wasted. And so I think that's sort of what Ray Dalio is talking about with like most believable people, is like find people who want to go to the layer of depth and nuance and complexity that you're interested in going, and go there with them.
the second principle he writes about is, if you're at an impasse, agree on a person you both respect and enlist them to help moderate the discussion. I actually haven't seen a lot of this happen, but I think it's kind of a smart idea. Like, if two people are really having a violent debate, that maybe it should be moderated. I've never seen it happen, but it sounds like a good idea.
Yeah. I think this one gets at a deeper underlying truth that I like a lot, which is one of the most important parts of disagreements is having a base shared view that you're on the same team, that you're two people working together to solve a problem. Because if it is me and then the problem and you on the other side of the problem and we're playing tug of war, it doesn't matter how big or small the problem is. We're going to be opponents, and we're going to like orient ourselves that way. And we can disagree about anything if we see each other as opponents. There is almost no problem in the world too big to be solved hand in hand if you and I are on the same side of it, pushing together. And so I think that what he is getting at here is both like, yeah, find someone that you respect, like help them, like ask them to help you move the conversation forward. But it's a person that you both respect. It's not a person that you both think is smart. It's not a person that you both, have as senior to you in the organizational hierarchy. It's a person that you both respect, because that means that you're going to trust them to engage in good faith. And your respect is going to be the thing that keeps you in this when you disagree or they make a call that you don't necessarily start out liking. Your respect is going to have to carry you through that. And the sub point is like, clearly, if you're at an impasse, your respect for your counterparty is probably like not carrying you through the impasse. So try and bridge that with shared respect for this third party. But the best thing that you can do is start by building individually and environmentally a culture of respect and sort of shared striving against problems on the same side as your teammates in order to not arrive at these
Right.
impasses.
His third principle is at the point of diminishing returns, you might just agree to disagree. I've done that a lot, right? It's just
Yep.
like, okay, we're not going to get anywhere. Let's just agree to disagree. So I definitely agree with that principle.
Yeah, sometimes you just gotta
Right.
cut your
And the
losses.
fourth is triangulate with smart people. I do think this is a good idea where sometimes, I might be in an argument. And to some degree, I kind of just don't know. And I think maybe the other person may not be as deep in the area as we need to be to have a really good, kind of discussion and debate about it. So I often do try and bring outside experts. I've been doing a lot with our, right now with HR, just a lot of questions about different HR policies and kind of other issues related to that. So I've been talking to so many people trying to get them to give us advice and different outside thoughts. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think again, this is you and I disagree on if it's an HR policy whether we should have like earned days off or unlimited time off, right? Strengths and weaknesses of both. And
Yeah,
so one of us believes one thing, one of us believes the other thing, and
yeah,
so we're like, okay, like we both have our perspectives. Let's go talk to someone who's like
yeah.
probably thought about
I've
this more
seen
than
that
we have,
debate
and
as.
then like maybe we'll let that
Yeah,
inform that
I've
debate.
actually seen.
It's everywhere. Did I?
No,
Are
no,
you
no, no, no,
debating
not
it right
not. Yeah,
now?
that's not an
Try.
issue for us. But all right. Well, I thought just kind of in wrapping,
Yeah.
maybe we could wrap with just any general advice or actually one thought that kind of comes to mind, and maybe we could tie it back to like the whole objective of having arguments is essentially like we're ultimately trying to drive to a decision of some kind, right? And maybe even um,
Yep.
I know, just kind of thinking out loud, when I think about you, Drew, and kind of like the Zynga context and the Riot context, do you think that the way
Hmm.
in which you have arguments or not, like, for example, Zynga is known for speed, right? Like making decisions
Yep.
fast, and Riot is kind of not known for speed. Do you think that maybe there is some impact of like having conflicts that actually lend itself to speed or not being so fast, or what do you think about that?
I think there's a Z causes
Okay,
X and Y thing with Zynga, speed, conflict, and what I would characterize as like incredible amounts of ownership and accountability for
okay,
selected individuals, right? So for better and for worse, uh, the fact that Zynga empowers very
mhm,
specific people to move as quickly as they want through decision making processes means that if that person wants to, they can prioritize speed and they are structurally empowered to do so at any point. And also, um, it encourages people to disagree because there is some amount of like safety net in all of those disagreements because at the end of the day, someone's going to make a call. Everyone goes into the conversation knowing that. And so there is sort of a um, the stakes are lower if you know that at the end of the day your head of product is going to make a call, and so all of it is just like, all right, like let's argue about it, let's like go as hard as we want and try and persuade this person because at the end of the day, like they'll make the call that is right to them or from their perspective. And so we actually have incredible freedom to disagree and to sort of like go at each other's points because um, that's sort of fine. Uh, I think when you have more diffuse or shared responsibility for decision making, one, it gets slower because consensus building becomes more important. If consensus building becomes more important, then you either need to have a really strong culture of disagree and commit, or you have to bring everyone along with you on that decision making journey, which means that you can't actually sort of tonally go as hard in all of those discussions because um, you might run the risk of sort of inflaming someone's ego and not letting them. I mean, the word lose is really rough here, but like sort of lose an argument gracefully, right? Like not get their way in a way that allows them to come out of the interaction reputationally intact. And so like a lot of that depends on how much importance your organization puts on the uh, the winning an argument, or like being the person who had the winning argument originally, versus whether coming up with a great argument is a shared team victory. Uh, in which case, again, there's sort of different degrees of psychological safety. And so I think a lot of that plays into speed and conflict orientation versus slowness and consensus building.
Right. And actually, as you're talking, Drew, one thing that kind of came to mind, you mentioned and I think Amazon's famous for popularizing this notion of disagree and commit. At times,
Yeah.
I feel that, and especially in some teams where you've got a bunch of superstars, and they don't agree, where there is disagreement,
Yeah.
right? Like how do you get a team? I mean, now we're talking about the knock-on effects of, let's say you win the argument
Right.
and a decision is made, and it would
Yep.
be great if everybody disagreed and committed. But what
Yep.
about the situation where they disagree and disengage? Okay, Drew, you win. It's 4 o'clock. Bye, everybody. I'm going home.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like,
Or yeah.
yeah,
Or like, yeah, sure, we'll build the feature your way, but like I'm not gonna bring my best self to building this
right.
feature
It's
because I think that we should have built it the other
yeah,
way.
it's totally half-assed, right?
Right. And so like what you need in order for like a deeper commitment is building a strong shared understanding of what you're going towards and what your assumptions are, so that someone can commit and bring their very best self to the subsequent work, right? If we say we're going to build the feature this way, or we're going to pick this backend, or we're going to have this HR policy, and someone says, well, like I'm gonna, spend a lot of my time as a backend engineer trying to mitigate all the downsides that we just signed up for, and
Yeah,
in doing so, completely destroy a bunch of the upsides of this selection that we made. Or someone says, oh, like we committed to a 2 days in the office policy, but I'm gonna just like undercut that every chance I can get because I think that's a stupid policy.
right,
And so like I'm just gonna tell my team that they never have to come in. And so now everyone's like, well, we're coming to the office every Tuesday and Thursday because like we expect everyone to be here. You're now not committed and you're removing a lot of the value of everyone being in the same place at the same time. So like what gives? That's disagreeing and
right,
disengaging. And a lot of the time, the common thread there is either through lack of understanding or sort of willfully sabotaging the value. The decision gets made and the upside isn't realized because individual agents get to make decisions that weaken the overall rationale
right.
for the big upside or for mitigating the big downside. And so that is unfortunate. You need to find ways of getting people on board with all of the upsides and all of the downsides. And if they can't do that, they might not be the right
Right.
person to be holding hands with you on that team.
Yeah, maybe that's a bigger topic for another time, how to get people to disagree and commit. But Drew, I want to thank you for your
Yeah.
time. What started off as like a random Slack conversation turned into, for me, a much deeper kind of, a much deeper set of like thoughts around obviously a very complex topic, and I definitely want to thank you for all your insights and your time. So thanks, Drew.
Yep.
And for the audience, hopefully you enjoyed this conversation and learned something. I certainly did, and definitely want to thank Drew for a lot of that, and we'll catch you next time. Bye, everybody.
Thanks so much for having me.